Rose. I'm so happy to see you all. This is my special interest, you could say. I'm quite obsessed with fruit trees. So today we're going to be covering the stone fruits, which cover a lot of things, but we're mostly going to focus on apricots, peaches, nectarines, cherries, plums, and pluots. Almonds is also in that category. I don't get a lot of questions about it, so I won't mention it, but they are all related. The reason I mention that is that technically they're all related enough that they can be grafted onto each other. So if you have any of those and you have this tree that you don't really like, technically you could cut it back, let it regrow enough, and like graft on something else. It's a magical, neat thing about like the stone fruit family is they're all genetically similar enough that they can bond to each other. All right, so my hand. This is Dustin. This is my boyfriend, partner in crime, and today he is my Vanna White. Yeah, he'll do my heavy lifting. I do fruit tree pruning outside of the nursery, pruning in consultation. And we do that together. It's not a Yamagami's thing, it's just my personal thing. And if you want to ask me questions about that, save it for the end of the class. I'm actually like super booked this season. So if you want to ask, I might be like, here's my card, but you're on the wait list. That's not what this is about. I just want to impart my knowledge to y'all. I've been learning this more in a detailed fashion for the last 8 years or so. I went to Cabrillo College over in Aptos in Santa Cruz County, horticulture degree, crop production major, and then I just learned everything else from being in the nursery trade and being drawn to the fruit trees. So there's a certain amount that I learned in classes, a lot that I just taught myself. And so everything that I know in this 8-page handout, it's all things that you can learn yourself. And they're really overwhelming at first, but then once you get into the rhythm of it, it's not too much. I just want to start by asking, raise your hand if like you're here today because you're about to buy new trees and like they're your first trees. Like you don't have any and you're like brand new, don't know where you're starting. So I see a few, like 2 or 3 hands. Okay. If you have trees in the ground in like the 1 to 5 year old stage, raise your hand. Okay. And then grandmother trees, where they've been in the ground decades. All right, we got a little bit of everything. Cool. I'll go lightly on the beginner stuff, and then we'll just move on to each category. So to start, when you're getting a brand new tree, you definitely want to do research before you're planting it in the ground. Your location needs to be sunny enough. There are no fruit trees that grow in shade. You have to have at least 6 hours of sunshine. I've seen trees get by with 3 or 4 hours, but I say get by, like they don't outright die. They struggle and they give maybe a few apples, but if they're in that part sun 3 to 4 hour window, they're going to have more disease problems, they're going to have more pest problems. So the recommended minimum is 6 hours of sunshine. Morning sun is great. If you have all day sun, some of the fruits, if you have like a heat wave in the middle of summer and it has that afternoon sun, it can get a little bit of sunburn. And so there's only so much control of that. But if you have just a morning, midday spot, that's great. If you have an all day spot, that's great. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be the entire day. 6 hours is your minimum. In terms of location, you want to have the tree planted about 10 feet away from any hardscapes or foundations. People plant things closer all the time, but I don't recommend it unless you've really done your research and you've had an arborist tell you, oh, that's okay. They can cause problems. Hardscapes also would include flagstone or like stone pathways because your trees are going to need to be sprayed yearly with like an oil spray, ideally, to prevent pests in that can stain. So location-wise, you want to keep that in mind. I've definitely that's where they have a tree and they have this hardscape, and they don't spray because of that. They have to put down a big drop of cloth to keep their driveway from spraying. So you can keep that in mind. Well-draining soil is also really critical. A lot of times, this is ground level, the root ball gets placed just right here. And then later, a year or two later, sinks a little bit. So ideally, when you plant it, you kind of have maybe like 10 or 20% above grade on a bit of a mound or a hill, so that it gets that better drainage. And then if it does settle back to kind of neutral level, it's fine. It's not in this sink. You've probably seen it, or you see someone's tree and it's just kind of got this sinkhole. Water is the #1 reason that problems happen. Water issues, too much water, not good enough drainage. And so you want to make sure that it's draining well and you have it on a little bit of a mound when you initially plant it.
What about a hillside?
What about a hillside? Hillsides are good. You would still actually want to consider that. I had a customer about a month ago that came in here and he was talking about some hillside planting that they've done. Hill was like so, they cut out a little divot, planted the tree, but they didn't put a mound in the divot, and so the divot ended up turning into like a sinkhole in the side of the hill still. And so I would still keep it in mind, make sure you're not having it do that sink in the spot that you carve out in the hillside. Or kind of, instead of carving in, kind of carve it out and then put it a little further out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We can talk about it at the end. If you have any long questions, I might end up being like, let's save that for the end. I'm happy to answer questions throughout the class. Question?
There's a place we had a tree that died, but was died in the drought. Can we assume that it's got good drainage and good light and that sort of thing?
If you have a tree that died in a drought, can you assume it has good light and good drainage? I would check. And you're going to want to remove that root and then give it a month or two before you plant something else in that spot. There are ways you can take a sample of your soil and send it to a lab and get all kinds of data back from it. We have, I think there's one locally in San Jose, there's a lab you can send it to, and it's somewhere from $20 to $50. I highly recommend, if you don't know what's going on in your soil, to get a soil test. It'll tell you your nutrients, it'll tell you your organic matter, the pH of your soil, a lot of different info. You can say, I have fruit trees, I want to do this soil test for fruit trees. Yeah, but I'll definitely check before I assumed.
Is that the last one they like to use?
I'm not sure. We have them listed on our reference site on the Plum's website. Yeah. So we go to the next little section. I'm going to go sequentially down the handout. Variety selection. There's so many varieties. We have 100 available here this year. They're not all out on the floor yet, but we have 100 different varieties that you get to choose from. And you're going to have maybe 1 to 4 trees, usually kind of the average one will have. Maybe you'll have up to 10. But these trees will fruit from anywhere from May to September. However, each individual tree, each individual variety, most of them only fruit for 2 weeks. Some of them might fruit for 6 weeks, and some of them might fruit for 8 weeks. But on average, most of them only fruit for 2 weeks. And so if I have one tree, this flavor cat nectarine, I'm going to get 2 weeks of fruit, give or take. One way that you can work with this is check the calendar of each tree that you're buying. You know, have some that go off in May, have some that go off in June, some in July, some in August, some in September. Individual trees. Or you can get a 4-in-1 tree, which would be this guy here. This is just cherries, but this is 4 different flavors. We've got Lappins, Van, Rainier, and Bing. These 4 different flavors have a slightly different harvest range. Cherries are actually not quite as big of a range. They're mostly all in May and June. But you would be expanding your range, and also cherries are one of the few trees that they need a buddy in order to pollinize correctly for some of the varieties. If you have a Bing, a Black Nectarine, or a Royal Rainier, and you just have that, they will not flower. They might flower, but they won't fruit. And so you need a buddy. There's also 4-in-1 trees. Can you back along to the right of you? Just make sure. Yeah, pull it closer. 4-in-1 trees called fruit salads. Anyone here have a fruit salad tree? 1, 2, 3. All right. Fruit salad trees are, in my opinion, wonderful and highly advanced. And I always hesitate at recommending them to beginners because you've got 4 different personalities that you're working with. You've got a nectarine, an apricot, a peach, and a plum. And because of that, they're gonna fruit at different times, which is great. But they also have different needs. They get different pests, and apricots don't like being pruned in winter here. And so you gotta like have a completely different time that you prune your apricot tree. They want a different time because they're more susceptible to fungal problems. Type of dieback, shot hole fungus, gummosis, a few different things to go over. So I don't prune apricots in the winter if I can help it. I prune them either right after harvest or August or September. You want to have it be dry for the next multiple weeks when you're pruning your apricot. And I'll be pruning one in the class today, but it's, I'm going to keep it dry before I put it back out on the floor. But yeah, so if you have a multi-graft tree, first off, see how closely these branches are to each other? I'm gonna grab it. Yeah, put it next to me. So I'm gonna just do some basic pruning on this one, so I can show you a few things. First off, this is a brand new tree. You're not usually gonna be working with as much mess and like doctoring as that very first time. The very first time you buy your tree, you plant it, you prune it, is critical. You have to prune it the first time, the first winter, or the first year. You don't want to plant it and let it grow for a while. There's a lot of structural things that, because we've bred these so much, are required. If we want them to perform as well as all of us want it to perform, it requires yearly pruning from year 1. So there's 4 Ds in pruning. There's the dead, damaged, diseased, and dysfunctional. I'm going to take off some of those, and I'm just going to cut right now the ones that are broken. You know, this goes a little faster. Just cut off all the ones that are.
Just where the break is, right?
Yeah, just where the break is. Don't have to take the whole thing. I was kind of touching it, kind of wiggling it, seeing if it's broken. Because a lot of times these come in.
Not that.
You can take that. So take out dead, damaged, diseased, disoriented. But these trees came into the nursery to my store like this, on a truck, in a pile. This is called bare root. Comes from Deciduous nursery. It's bare root. This is completely normal. And we put them in the pots to make it floor stable, so we can sell them for the whole year. You can buy it like this. If you can find a nursery that sells it like this, keep it wet. Water in the morning, water in the evening, and have it like this for up to like 2 weeks before it's a problem, as long as it's in the shade, out of the sun, moist, and then planted and everything's fine. So when they come in on the truck, if the nursery hasn't pruned them yet, you need to check for problems. You need to check for broken, dead branches, and do that first pass on everything. Yeah.
So, reason being, stuff like this branch, because of that angle, it tells me it probably got damaged in transport or some point along its way. And it's still holding on, and it's still alive, and it'll still grow, but it's probably never really going to be that strong. And if you don't get, prune it out early, and it becomes one of your main branches later, then it bears fruit, then it breaks off, and it's gone.
And you invested time.
Yeah, you invested all the time. The tree's invested a bunch of energy in it.
Like this one here, for example, I can feel right here is where it got bent in transit. It's never going to get stronger. I've actually intentionally left some on trees of mine before. It never actually beefs up and becomes healed. It will usually eventually break. And so it's better to just take it off early. And when you're taking off branches, you always want to leave a little stub. You don't want to cut it flush. You cut it flush, it's going to create an entry point for disease and pests. It doesn't heal over properly. So yeah, so we have this 4-in-1 tree. It's really tight, it's really dense. I would immediately, if this is my my tree, put some limb spreaders in it. This is for training purposes, to train the angle of the branches. If it's really tight and dense, you're gonna have more airflow problems. You're gonna have light penetration problems. And so while the branches are young and flexible for that first year, you can get these limb spreaders and just give them a little more space. They're like $1, you know, no big deal. And then when it's done, after a year, you kind of check, you know, oh, is it holding that shape that I asked it to take? And it usually is done within 6 months to a year, if it's a young branch like how these are. These are, let's see, 16-year-old tree. So that would be like a better shape for it to have, is having a little bit more of like a nice base shape that's going over to each other. And you don't really want a whole lot of branches on the inside. You don't need to clean cut it. You don't need to clear cut it, but you can keep short little sections, but you don't want the inside to be dense. Airflow is really important for the trees. All right, any questions?
Rose, how do you know it's 2 years old?
So look at page 4. There's a picture in the bottom left. I circled something in blue. I don't know how well it translates, but I'm going to move a few things around.
Yeah, we're plenty about that.
Let's see.
We're on this guy.
I want one with a year mark.
Yeah.
That one has it.
It's like also.
I'm going to switch these around. Usually I have a lot more space at these classes. All right. So there's this thing called a year mark. When the tree goes dormant, the bud on the tip, the apical meristem, is going to cap. And when the growth continues in spring, it's going to leave a wrinkly 360-degree ring that when I see that, I know, oh, that's when it went to sleep and that's the new year growth. So on this one, it's not as much. It's easier to see on older trees, but there's this is the last year's growth right here, and then right here, there's this little wrinkly 360 scrunched ring. And this here is the previous year before that. And so that, especially when people haven't pruned it, you could look at an unpruned deciduous tree, fruit tree, and count exactly how old it is. And you just go, oh, 1, 2, 3. Cool. So that's the year mark. All right. So, variety selection. There's a lot of places you can go to read about them. The Dave Wilson Nursery website is a great one. If you're shopping here, I put the QR code for our list. That's going to be available on the floor. We have gotten through, I think, the Asian pears. Not everything's on the floor yet, but it will probably be within the next 1 to 2 weeks. But do your research before. And if you want, or if you can, try and taste it before you buy it and plant it. There's not a lot of places that actually put the names out, but places that do would be Andy's over in Morgan Hill, Andy's Orchard Fruit Stall in Morgan Hill. They operate spring through fall. They have amazing fruit. I've gone. It's expensive, but it's spectacular, and it's worth every dollar. They have the varieties listed. And about half, whenever I was going in, Morgan Hill. Yeah, about half when I went in were ones from Dave Wilson. The others were from other growers, but they have the names for all of them, which is really critical information. There's also a place called Novakovich Orchards in Saratoga, and they're like a spring and summer thing. Neither of these are a youth pick place, but they have a stall that you can go and you can buy it and they'll have the names on them. Yeah, for variety selection, there's not really a bad fruit. Not really. They're all good when they're grown correctly. If you have a fruit tree that you have and it doesn't taste good, make sure that your water is correct, make sure that your fertilizer is correct and your sun situation is correct. Prune it correctly. Within 2 years, your tree can completely transform. Yes?
Unless it's just root stock.
Unless it's just rootstock. Yeah. So this is 2 trees. right here. Does anyone know what a rootstock is? Cool. So this part from here to here is yellow tag, level rootstock, level peach rootstock. This is a level peach. Level peaches don't taste good, but they have really strong roots. And so this part between my hands is a level peach. And then this part here is a Nectarine miniature nectarine. This is a genetic dwarf. They stay very small. This one, oh boy, yeah, very, very small. They only grow a tiny amount, maybe 6 inches a year, maybe 12 if you're giving it a lot of fertilizer. Anyways, this is 2 trees. They grafted the nectarine on top of it and grew it out because they want the fruit from this and they want the health from this. So this tree is best in the ground because these are level rootstocks. Rootstocks, this is a big rootstock. It's a full-size tree. This is a tiny tree on top of it. So they took the energy from the rootstock and then put a tiny tree on top of it so it wouldn't be as weak. Any questions on that? Great.
Something else I wanted to say on it, because the point of bringing that up is what originally was that if it dies here, now you've got a level peach only, and if you don't realize that, and then branches come off, and then 5 years later, you're like, why do I have these peaches that don't taste good? That's not going to be fixed by all the other things that you mentioned.
I had a customer that I went to their house, they had, I think, 2 rootstock trees. They bought the house, it came with all these fruit trees. It had these big trees, and I was like, it doesn't look quite right. And then we got to go visit back while it was fruiting. Looks beautiful. Looks beautiful. Tastes like water.
Can you graft something onto it at that point?
You could graft something onto it. Peaches don't, when they're big, it's harder.
Okay.
You could graft something onto it though. You'd have to kind of do a takeover, and there's a lot more skill involved in that. Yeah.
A lot of effort.
A lot of effort, yeah.
Rose, one more quick thing.
Yes.
This would be now. Would be
Yes.
time to start this one.
Yes.
Which we were talking about, so.
Okay, so this tiny little thing here is Craig's Crimson Cherry. It had a critical break, and so I cut it back. It was broken up here-ish, and so I cut it until I was down into clean, healthy wood that wasn't damaged. The graft union is here, down at the bottom. So this is still fruiting. This is great. This is going to be a wonderful, easy pick tree in 3 or 4 years. It's going to branch right here. If you want a small tree, Dustin, can you bring a chair over so I can put it on top of it for a second? Yeah, put it on top. So go in the back, you can see it. Yeah. So if you wanted an easy pick tree, this is what you got to do. You got to prune it down at like 1 or 2 feet, and then slowly build your canopy up, which I've done many times, and it's my favorite way to do it. It does require more time, and it feels icky if you're not used to doing it because you're cutting off this massive amount. However, when you prune in winter, all of the mass that you cut off of your tree is going to grow back that year as bonus wood, because the tree went to sleep in September, started pushing all the carbs, all of the sugars down to the root zone around August, September, and it took tally. It was like, oh, I'm going to make energy for all of this. And it's working and doing that thing. And if you cut it in winter when it's not looking at itself, it's like it's separated almost. It's made all of that energy, and the tree's going to explode. So you're going to have a lot of growth. So when you cut it low, if you cut off a lot, you're going to get it back. You do need to balance that. If you cut more than 30%, the tree's going to go crazy. I don't recommend it. The first cut is like kind of the exception, because sometimes you need to.
When they're very young.
When they're very young, this first year. Let's just say I could cut this, I'm going to get growth up to here, you know? And maybe halfway through the season, I might do a cut or two to encourage it to branch a little more. Or else I just might have this long shoot like this. This is a whole 1 year of growth, which has no side branching on it. And so you could train in this little tree that stays, you know, this big for a while.
You've talked about the different ages of the trees and doing these in the first year, and some of these are more than 1 or 2 years old. So is it the first year that you own it, or the first year that of the tree? I know I've got I have a couple that are like 2 or 3 years old. Am I too late?
Yep. Yeah. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. And at the end of, like, you know, the hour mark, if anyone is free. I will walk out into the parking lot and talk about the older trees. It's just hard to bring them inside. All right. Yeah.
So, sorry, was it the first year that you owned it, or
So
the first year
the
that?
first year, this is 1 year of growth
Okay.
right here. So when I'm talking about this when it's the first year for the tree.
Or for the area you're pruning, I think that'd be a good way to put it. Like if it's a branch that just grew as a year or like
Yeah.
too old and you're cutting that way
It's
back.
the age of the wood.
Yeah, but if it's an old tree.
And the
and-
ones you sell here, are they all first year trees?
Most of the trees here that are in the paper pots are between 1 to 2 years old. If they're in a plastic pot and they're bigger, say like a 15-gallon, they might be 3 to 4 years old. A lot of the times they're a lot younger than you might think. Yeah, but if you have a tree at home that's, I don't know, 8 years old or something, there is a different way of pruning it. Yeah. Okay, so varieties we covered, chill hours. Our chill hours is a kind of mathematical formula. It's tallying how many hours between November and February that the area collects temperatures between, I think it's 32 and 45, or at least in a fair, simple form, under 45. The fruit buds themselves need this chill in order to develop the ability to even fruit correctly. There's trees that need 100 chill hours, there's trees that need 1,000 chill hours. We try and only stock things here that work for this area. The only exception is cherries. Everybody wants Bing cherries. Bing cherries don't fruit consistently here, they also need a pollinizer. That's why foreign ones are so great. This has got 4 flavors, they all pollinize each other. So on that little chart on the first page, Bing and Black Tartarian, not only are they high chill and they won't fruit consistently in this local area, Santa Clara County, they also need a pollinizer, they need a buddy. And it can either be another branch that's a different flavor.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the black tartarian and the big don't pollinize each other?
I did not say that. They don't pollinize themselves.
I
So if
think
you have a
they're-
single, you have just a Bing, or you just have a Black
Oh,
Tartarian
okay.
and no others,
Okay.
they will not fruit on their own.
Okay.
Yeah, you would need the appropriate pollinizer.
Wouldn't if big and tartarian have 2 plants side by side, would they pollinate each other?
I'd have to double check my list to see what the pollinizers are. I don't know that off the top of my head, but if they're compatible pollinizers, then yes, I would have to double check that.
It's within the distance that something is gonna pollinize those two. Like
Yeah.
within the distance of bee flies is what she
Within the
said.
same yard, I'd say like, to be really careful, like how far you can go, is probably a reasonable distance for having the trees in the same area.
10:30.
Okay, I'm gonna pause questions for now, because note your questions down. I wanna make sure we get all the content through. So, for cherries, there's some things that need a lot of chill. You really wanna check your tag and make sure, is it a high chill plant? What do I have? Where do I live? What's the temp in my area? Places like Gilroy, Morgan Hill, they get more chill, and so they're gonna be able to handle those other varieties better. For pollinizers, most of the trees here don't need a pollinizer, but if they do, it'll say it on the tag. And so just check, is it self-fertile, meaning it can pollinate itself, it doesn't need a buddy, or does it need a pollinizer? And then decide if you have space for 2. So moving on, for peaches and nectarines, they're probably the most popular fruits for this area. Everybody loves peaches and nectarines. There's white peaches, there's yellow peaches, there's clingstone, or there's freestone. There's a lot of different options in there. They're all delicious. They all only fruit for 2 weeks each. And so you want to ask yourself, is 2 weeks enough? Do I need multiple trees? Do I need a multi-graft? There's a lot of different options for multi-grafts. And I did some of my favorites on that cheat sheet. I really like the ones that not only are they delicious, but they also have really beautiful blossoms. And so there's a section for the yellow and the white for like the showy blossoms. My all-time favorite is Atomic Red Nectarine. Super dark magenta buds that open up to hot magenta. And they're double petaled, so they're really fluffy. And then it's the most delicious, juicy white nectarine I've ever had in my life. So, like, there's some gems out there. Question?
any particular time that the best to plant the peach tree?
Particular timing for planting would be while it's dormant, ideally. I don't recommend planting in summer. Summer is hard on trees in general, but any time while it's dormant is ideal. Yeah, dormant meaning when they have no foliage on them. Okay, so we talked a little bit about rootstocks. I'm going to go real briefly over it. There's full size, there's semi-dwarf, and there's dwarf. Full size can be, if you never prune it, it can be anywhere from 15 to 30 feet for a full size tree if you never prune it. I have many customers that have a full size tree and we prune it twice a year and we keep it under 10 feet. They tend to be healthier, they tend to have more vigor. This is of course if everything's going right, you know, if you're not taking care of it, things can go wrong regardless. But they tend to have more disease resistant, more drought tolerance, and they're just a little less troublesome in terms of like having to troubleshoot problems. They are bigger, the growth will be thicker and longer, and you have more that you need to cut off. But that does mean that you'll have stronger wood sections to keep. Whereas a semi-dwarf, such as citation rootstock on a peach, you're going to get shorter growth. Maybe you'll get, you know, a little bit versus this much on a full size, but you're going to have a smaller section of rigid, strong growth. The yearly pruning on the trees, let's switch these two out. I think I'm done with this one completely. So this is a really nice nectarine. I picked it because it has a good shape, nice base shape coming off. And if I was doing yearly pruning on this, I would only be working on the growth that grew last year, primarily. You can tell by the color of the bark. It's got a bit of a red, bronzy color to it. Sometimes it's green on the bottom and red on the top, depending on the sun and the cold and all that jazz. For peaches, the best fruit is in the middle 1/3 of the branch. Why? That's kind of how it goes. And so this whole section here, this is all new growth. So I would only keep 2/3 of this section, and I would do that to the whole tree. So I would just very quickly go through, kind of touch all the branches, see how strong they are. Ideally, you want to keep branches that are pencil thick and rigid. So like this one is, I'm touching it where it connects to the main leaf, kind of tap it, starts to bend around here, and that's around halfway. I'm okay with that. I'm going to go for strength versus keeping all the fruit, because I don't want my branch breaking and losing all my fruit. So I keep anywhere from 1/4 to 2/3 of the branch, depending on the strength of the branch. Some of the branches I might completely take out, like this little tiny one right here. I would leave like one bud, maybe. But I could go through the whole thing to kind of touch each branch, and just if it's kind of floppy, it's not going to be able to hold the weight of your fruit well. So you can keep a few buds so that it can hopefully strengthen up over time. But if I'm just doing the yearly, if everything was right and everything was good, and this was like this is a nice healthy branch, nice pencil thick right here, I would keep 2/3, looks like something I cut off there at some point. I'd keep 2/3, maybe around here. I'm intentionally cutting right above a bud pointing out into open space, because that's where the leaf bud, this has got 3 buds in this little section, that's how peaches do. The bud in the middle is a leaf, the buds on the outside are peaches. When it's a set of 3. And so that leaf bud's going to turn to my branch and continue in this direction. You want to orient your cuts with the direction that it's facing in mind. When you make your cut, you don't want it to be too long. You wouldn't want to say cut right below a bud and leave a stub. That's going to just die back anyway. You want to cut right above a stub, or right above a bud, and you want to, if it's pointing up towards the sky, cut at an angle so that the water will roll off. You don't want the water to just sit there. It might soak in and cause fungal problems. Okay, so full size is great. This is on, I think, a full size rootstock. Semi-dwarf, I hear a lot of confusion between dwarf and semi-dwarf. I'll have a customer that says, I have a dwarf. And I'm like, are you sure? Because I know what this tree is, and I know that this tree doesn't come in a dwarf rootstock. And so you always need to check the tags. Like this tree, the white tags are the variety, This tag here is the rootstock. I can look at it and it'll tell me unpruned tree height, 30 to 40 feet. This is a standard rootstock. I can look at a citation tag and it'll say 8 to 12 feet for peaches. If you look at that same tag, citation is a very flexible rootstock. It can cover all the stone fruits. But if you put a peach on it, it'll dwarf it more. If you put a plum on it, it won't dwarf it as much. So I had someone the other day saying they had a dwarf apricot, and I was like, oh, is it a pick seed? Because that's the only genetic actual dwarf apricot I know. And they're like, no, it's a blenheim. Blenheim apricots, the smallest rootstock is citation. Citation is going to dwarf it to 12 to 18 feet on prune. That's not very dwarf to me. Question?
Can you go into a backyard and look at a tree and go, I can tell what this tree is. It's this kind of peach and it was rootstock. I mean, what is our ability when we don't know what we've inherited to figure out what it is?
So can I go into the backyard and look at a tree and know exactly what it is? I could go in and say that's a peach, and I can look at it and probably say how old it is. If it has a rootstock tag on it, I can tell you more information. Otherwise, you'd have to look at when it fruits and compare it to like a fruit harvest chart. This is a wonderful chart. On the first page, I just have it written in small print under variety. Let's see, where do I have it on here? It's the Dave Wilson Fruit and Nut Harvest Chart. I have it under Harvest Windows. Yeah, Dave Wilson Nursery Fruit and Nut Harvest Chart. Type that into Google. This massive thing pops up with all the harvest windows. And you can say, okay, my fruit is fruiting in May through early June. What fruits? And that way they can narrow it down.
And the blossoms are a clue sometimes too.
Sometimes the blossoms are a clue as well. Yeah, that's about all.
We have to have you come to our house 3 or 4 times a year.
Or take pictures and bring samples. Yeah. And another really great company that has way more availability than me is Orchard Keepers. It's based on Santa Cruz, but they serve the whole day. Much bigger fruit tree company than me, and they have more experience than me. They are my role models. All right, so moving on. So semi-dwarf and dwarf rootstock. To be clear, most things are going to be semi-dwarf or full size, and then something like this. The part on the top, this is genetic dwarf, meaning it only gets 5 feet on the variety itself, 5 or 6 feet, but this rootstock is large, and so it couldn't necessarily go into a pot easily. If you did, and you like bonsaiing things, you could take it out every year and trim the roots, and you could keep it in a pot and see what happens. But otherwise, I recommend these in the ground. And it's always checked, because a semi-dwarf tree, depending on what the rootstock is on, if it's on an apricot versus a peach, you want to know exactly how big it's actually going to get. You can control it yourself with yearly pruning, but you kind of want to know what you're signing up for. Yeah. All right. So a lot of different tools you can use in your pruning. This is my favorite. This is a Felco pruner. If you have your own fruit trees, you don't want to get a cheap pruner because they're probably going to break after 3 uses. You need something that can handle at least 3/4 inch or 1 inch of a thick branch. And then for anything bigger, I like having a nice folding saw, personally, or you can get loppers, which are pretty much a pruner, but just with longer handles. I can do most of my work with those two tools, and they cover everything.
How
And so,
often do you get them sharpened?
how often do you sharpen them? Isn't it handyman?
No, not daily.
A few times a season?
Yeah, a couple
Maybe.
times a season, unless we like hit a piece of metal that was in a tree that we didn't know or something.
Yeah.
They hold up pretty good.
All
You
the
can
pieces
replace, yeah,
are replaceable. Yeah.
you
And
can
so
replace the blades on those, which is what's great about them, because sometimes you just ding it on something and it happens.
you cut wire on accident. Yeah.
I did want to say with the loppers, we'll use loppers as a breakdown tool, but I don't particularly like using them on the tree because a small cut, the shears, pruning hand pruners are going to go through it really clean, but when it's bigger, even if your blade's sharp, it feels like it kind of mashes it just a little bit, and I don't really like leaving the tree like that. So when the branch gets bigger and harder, I think a saw is a better tool for leaving a clean cut.
Yeah, having a really clean cut on your trees is super important. If you're leaving jagged cuts, it's not going to seal the wound off properly, and it's going to have either moisture moisture be able to come in and have fungal problems or die out. You always want a nice, clean cut, always, yeah. And if it's not clean, that's like one of the only times you want to use like a tree sealant, like Farwell's or a tree paint. If you cut back and you see like dead wood or die out, you might want to seal that over. Otherwise, sealant is really not required. The tree knows how to fix itself. Sealant is really only when you're trying to cover a little wound that you can't fix completely and leave clean. Okay, let's see. So winter pruning versus summer pruning. There's two different times of year for these things. When you're pruning winter, you get regenerative growth. If I cut off, let's say, I'm just going to do some real quick. I would keep maybe 3 handstands, outward facing bud of all of these. And everything that I cut off, the tree is going to grow it back right at that tip. And so all of this is going to grow back, and then it's going to grow what it was going to grow anyway for the season. And so when you put in winter, you get regenerative growth. You get bonus growth.
Will we just go in the same direction, or does it spread?
Well, the growth's going to start here, if I'm lucky. If I'm not lucky, it'll die down to the next bud and grow on the inside. And then you might want to fix that real quick. Ideally, you want your growth going outward, away from the middle, like a nice vase. But the growth will be at all these tips, and then maybe a little bit below it as well.
Yeah, it does encourage branching.
It encourages branching. When you take the tip off, the tip is suppressing side growth when it exists. It's a constant battle. It's a hormone battle. The side ones actually, what's the word? They kind of repress the tip. If you have no tip, the side branches, the lateral branches, take dominance for a while until a new tip, a new apical meristem forms. And so if you're trying to get a lot of side branching, you've got to keep tipping. Even if you're just taking off, one bud. If you want more branching, you tip it. Okay. So winter pruning, best for peaches, nectarines, plums, apricots for this category that we're talking about, and most other fruits as well. Yes.
What else you were getting to was that when you prune in the winter, you're getting that regenerative growth. If you're trying to slow the tree down, if it's a big tree and you don't want it bigger, pruning when it has all the leaves on, you're removing more energy and you're kind of making the tree slow down a bit. So if you're working on a tree, you want it not to get bigger. You don't necessarily want to do it when it's dormant because you're then kind of encouraging it to keep going bigger.
Yeah. So if you're wanting growth, prune in winter. If it's within this category of peach, nectarine, plum, and apricot, plum, and pluot. For apricot and cherries, apricots in particular, but both of them, apricots always prune in the summer. Always prune in the summer. I know people that prune them in winter, they've gotten away with it, and that's great. That's lucky. Because we're coastal, we have this wet, they can get fungal problems real easily.
In regards to cherries.
And cherries are just so vigorous. If you want to have moderate growth, you prune in summer. It'll slow down how much. It'll reduce the branching you get. So if you want a smaller tree that's more manageable, you prune the cherry in the summer, around August, September. Because they want to get, on the smallest, like one that we sell here, the smallest one would be a 14-foot tree at full size. That's the smallest tree.
You might not do that the first couple of years because you're training it and you're wanting it to get bigger, but once it's at or close to the size you want, then it makes sense to switch.
Yeah. So summer pruning, I recommend for the apricot and the cherry, and for things like nectarine or plum, if you have a tree, you're pruning it in the winter, maybe it's year 4 or year 5, and it's starting to just get really big, and you're noticing you're like, okay, this is enough. You would do more pruning in summer. You would start doing what I call the haircut. It's like, here's the tree, and you've got your growth to a certain point. Your new growth, you would cut that kind of outward shell back in summer. You're not cutting the new growth off. You're doing what you would do in winter. You're cutting it back, and that slows down and kind of holds the shape. And you do kind of the internal work, the minutia that you need to see the skeleton of the tree for in winter. You do like the mass removal in the summertime. it slows it down a lot, and it's going to be able to keep it at a much more manageable size. Also, when we prune in summer, it actually produces, just the way the chemicals work, it encourages more fruit production, fruit spurs, as they're called. I don't think I have anything with the sample of spurs. These are all too young. Can you bring the top back here? So cherries, plums, pluots, and apricots get these things called spurs. These little side branches here are apricot spurs. They are short sections that grow off of 2 to 4 year old wood, and all they do is fruit. They're not really going to have a whole lot of foliage, whereas this here, there's going to be more foliage, but they're temporary fruit production zones. For apricot, it's 2 to 4 years of growth, and then they'll die off, and you'll notice kind of this trend of the wood cycling out. So when you have pruning that you do in summer, you're going to encourage more fruit spurs, especially on cherries and apricots, plums and pluots as well, apples and pears as well. That's a different day.
And then something else on that, while you're on that note, is a lot of times apricots will grow really long and lengthy, and they'll have those fruit spurs, and they have a little other growth at the end. So if you're not doing any pruning, 4 or 5 years into that, you've got long branch with a little branching, long branch with a little branching, long branch with a little branching, and the whole thing breaks off with the next year that fruit's heavy. So it's important about shortening them up.
Yeah, apricots, peaches, and nectarines, personally, I have found in the work that I do, they really just want to just grow a long branch. And they don't do a whole lot of side branching if you're not pruning them to encourage that. And so it's good to go through whenever you notice, I've got this new branch coming out, it's great, it's growing out, it's really going. And then maybe you prune it back to like 1 or 2 hand spans length, even in the middle of the season. Because if you prune it, it's going to branch out right below that cut. And you're going to encourage more lateral side branching and have more fruit production areas versus these long, lengthy sections. And especially with peaches and nectarines and apricots, I have found that they're really hard to make small again. They need to be cut back. It's called a drop crotch cut. When you cut back, let's say this is a really big tree, right? And I want to do a hard cut back. I can't just cut in the middle somewhere like this. I can't do that. I could do that on a plum or an apricot or a pluot or a cherry or a pear. I cannot do this on a peach or nectarine. It'll just die down to the next side branch. So when you make a cut on apricot, peaches and nectarines, on like older wood especially, you have to go back to a side branch. You must. If you don't, you're not going to get the response that you're looking for. And so if I'm doing, the yearly pruning on this, taking a little bit off, all of my buds facing out and away. If I wanted, if this was way too long, I could cut it back, say here, and I'll get more regenerative growth because of that. But I wouldn't just cut to a random spot. And if I didn't have anything to cut back to, I'm kind of screwed. And so you kind of want to set yourself up in the early times when the tree is young by tipping and pruning regularly, so you have these side branches to cut back to later when it's become this 6-foot lengthy branch if you haven't done anything.
Yeah, and then that helps on the long term in another way, because what Rose was talking about when it's the done size that you don't want any bigger, and you're doing that yearly haircut, eventually you've got to start picking branches that you're taking down lower again and kind of resetting, because the haircut that you do, you might only leave 6 inches, 6 inches year after year becomes feet. And so you want some lower branching to come back in and replace those later.
They don't like
making sense when I'm describing.
They don't like just if you've got a big peach tree way up here and there's all these like bare branches here, the tree will not make new branches down here. It's just not going to do it. It's just not how they function. And so you have to keep yourself up for having backups for where you're going to cut back to when you want to reset that size. In commercial ag, peaches and nectarines never have more than, like 2 to 4 years worth of growth on them, like in terms of the age of the branch of like where they're getting the fruit. They're constantly cutting them back to have that regenerative growth so that they have larger fruit wood sections. Because if you have a really old peach or nectarine, you might just have this little itty bitty section on the end of your branches, maybe an 8-year-old tree, so it starts becoming problematic. And that's all you get, is that short little section at the end of the tree, and you have nowhere to cut back to easily. And have people be like, oh, I want to make it smaller. And I'm like, I can't do that. So you gotta set yourself up from the beginning, or it becomes hard. Yeah. Okay, so really basic fertilizer. If you've got a brand new tree, bone meal goes in the hole. Bone meal is for root growth. Bone meal is great. It's also good for maybe more fruit, but like new tree, bone meal goes in the hole. If you don't know what your soil is like, if you haven't gotten it tested or anything, and maybe you feel like it's a little sterile of soil, or it's been hard packed, or you have construction or something, azomite is a multivitamin for trees, basically. Iron, magnesium, calcium, zinc, all kinds of good stuff. But a little bit of this in the hole for new trees that you haven't worked the soil. If your tree has problems and you haven't given it anything like this for a while, put this around the tree. It's really, really good. Langbonite is potassium. Potassium is sweetness. That's it. It also makes the new branches grow more liquid. I love this stuff. You don't need to put them every year. You want to do it once, as needed, every few years. Langbonite, potassium, 0,022. There are other products that will give you the same thing. This is just the one that we carry. First number is nitrogen, green growth. It has none. Second number, phosphorus. Phosphorus is your root development. It's your flower and bud development. This one has none. Potassium. This one's only potassium. It has a few other nutrients in it as well, but it's primarily potassium. And so potassium is your sweetness. This is the thickness of the branches. If
How much you put in there?
2 cups.
2 cups?
About. Depends on the side of the tree. Nice little sprinkle around the base of the tree as wide as the canopy. If you have an old tree, or you don't want to think about it, just use an all-purpose fertilizer for your yearly fertilizing. It should be 2 to 3 times a year, depending on the tree, depending how old it is. Stone fruits, when they're younger, it should be 3 times a year, once in spring, once in summer, once in fall. If it is an older tree, some people will just do 2. It's fine. You know your tree better than me and whether or not it's doing well with or without fertilizer.
Trees on the fall?
Yeah, that's on page 3. Other things,
Sprinkled around you at the beginning.
I mean, ideally you dig it in, absolutely.
Water in.
Yeah,
Clay
dig it in,
soil.
water it in. If you have very clay soil, you might want to add some gypsum. And you can sprinkle that. That can be something you add over the years. It does help loosen clay soil. Yeah.
Where you go into mulch is the next thing, because that's very good at that.
I was going to mention for peaches and nectarines, since they tend to be more disease susceptible, how many of you have had peach leaf curl? Yeah, we all get peach leaf curl. There are ways to prevent it. That's next on the
What does it
list.
look like that we would know we had it?
It'll look like pinkish, red, bubbly, cancerous growth on the foliage.
Oh, on the leaf, okay.
Yeah. There's a picture of it. Don't worry. I'll look at that. That's a long time after the ocean. Yeah, this picture is on page 7. Okay, so if you have peaches and nectarines, I actually recommend adding compost and worm castings in the winter as like a supplemental thing, because it feeds the root system, and the root system is the immune system of the tree. It makes it more able to fight off problems and diseases. So specifically for peaches and nectarines, I do recommend worm castings and compost. And you would do that winter, late winter, when the rains are happening. It's when the trees are about to wake back up. Now through February, March. It's a loose thing, but doing it yearly before the tree wakes up. Okay, timestamp.
We're almost, it's like 5 till 3 minutes left.
Okay. All right.
Should be good for taking it to happen.
I know, right? Okay, I'm gonna go over pests and diseases a little bit. every tree has pests and diseases. There's a few that have minimal, but we're not talking about any of them today. So for fun, that would be pomegranate, that would be persimmon, they don't really have any problems. They have them, oh man, they're so minimal. So if you have pests and diseases on your tree, you want to check if it's getting what it needs. Are you watering correctly? Watering correctly depends on the age of the tree and the type of the tree. If it's a peach or a nectarine, it's on citation, semi-dwarf rootstock. They are not drought tolerant. They like shallow, frequent water. They're one of the few things that when I see it in a lawn, I'm like, I think it's actually okay. Most trees don't like being in lawns because it's shallow, frequent water. It's not enough to soak the root ball. If any of the other trees, it depends on the age of the tree. So yes.
What was that word? Shallow, frequent water was?
Peaches and nectarines.
On
On
citation.
semi-dwarf citation rootstock. They have very shallow roots. They are not drought tolerant. They're like one of the only things that can maybe make it in a lawn situation. Don't quote me too hard on that. I don't like it still. But for apricots, cherries, plums, pluots, correct watering would be year one. In summer, you're watering once a week. You're watering 10 gallons for every inch of trunk diameter, measured around handstand from the ground. So if it's a 1-inch trunk, you're giving it 10 gallons of water. If it's a 2-inch trunk, because it's probably older, it will need 20 gallons of water. The location that the water is being given, I am the tree. My canopy is out to here. My water is here in a circle. It is not here at my feet. That's the canopy drip line. If it was raining, that is where the water would roll off the canopy and fall to the ground. You're trying to mimic nature. So watering frequency depends on the age of the tree. How much depends on the age of the tree, and that, you know, inch per 10 gallons per inch is kind of just a rough way of figuring it out. But for most of these trees, year one, once a week. Year two, every 2 weeks. Year three, you're at every 3 weeks. Year four, you should be at once a month. These are all fairly drought tolerant trees, except the peaches and nectarines. They are never drought tolerant. They are the princess of fruit trees in terms of water. So you make sure your watering is correct. They already talked about fertilizer. If your tree is not happy, make sure your fertilizer is correct. Be diligent for 2 years before you give up on your tree. And then sunlight, of course. So pests and diseases, the main ones that I hear about on a regular basis are peach leaf curl. So we're looking at leaf 7. Peach leaf curl, which will look like a red, kind of bubbly growth coming off the leaf. It is the leaf. It's bubbly and it's malformed. To prevent that, you spray with liquid copper, and you spray it with horticultural oil. These are made to use together. These are concentrates. You put them in a pump spray bottle and you spray it on the trees. But the liquid copper is a fungicide, and it's going to prevent the fungal spores that the peach leaf curl is from spreading to the blossoms, spreading to the leaves. And you spray it in 3 times during the growing season: December, January, February.
I would say those two mix together.
Oh yeah, you mix them together because they're made to be together and they bind. The oil keeps the copper there instead of just washing off. The copper's kind of watery, and so you want to use both, ideally. Yeah. And when you're done spraying, you rinse out your sprayer same day with soap and water because it will clog. But if you spray that, especially in February for peaches and nectarines, in February when the buds are skinny, and they start to round, it's called the popcorn phase. And right after that, it's going to show a little pink at the top. But when they're round and they're closed and at that popcorn stage, that's when you do the peach leaf spray. You do the fungal spray. You do the liquid copper and the horticultural oil at the same time. That is the key time. If you do that, you're probably fine. If you're unlucky and you still get the peach leaf curl, there's things you can do. Get like a liquid seaweed, which I'm about to grab here. A liquid seaweed concentrate. You spray that out for the next 3 months, just once a month, and it actually kind of like stops, suppresses, and slows down the spread of the fungal problem, and it heals it faster and also gives it a little nutrients. So
And
there are things you can do.
if it's a small enough tree that it's manageable to do so, you can literally just pick off the leaves that have it and get rid of them. Don't let them just lay
Yeah,
on the ground.
and when you're spraying with the seaweed, like you should also be picking off the leaves
Sometimes,
as it goes.
if it's a giant tree, that's a giant task.
Yeah.
So,
Ideally, then, if you do get peach leaf curl, you would remove the affected leaves. Like when it's done for the year, you would rake that foliage away, and you would get rid of it. And then when you're doing your spray, you would include the ground in your spray because you're trying to like eradicate this fungal problem. One other pest that is pretty common is Gommosis. I found this tree on the floor for you guys.
Rose gets really grossed out by Moses.
It's so gross. It looks like amber colored tree boogers.
It's just like a little jelly blob there.
Yeah, I'm just gonna like let you guys. Can you drop it? Let's see the wiggle. Yeah.
But it's on the branch.
Yeah, it fell off.
That one fell off.
Yeah.
But it's on the ground. It's a little blob.
It'll be there. We can leave it separate.
We'll leave it. You'll actually walk it over to the back.
I can't.
Yeah. So Gommosis is something that if you're preventatively spraying, you're going to have less of it. Your tree is going to be healthier. It is a fungal problem. And it's going to kind of seep out of injuries. Sometimes it's not a big deal, but it can be gross and it can be problematic. It's kind of a sign that something's out of balance, and it's something you can prevent by doing like a fungal spray.
Same spray.
Same spray. Yeah. If you have mushrooms around the base of the tree, I would water less. You might also have mushrooms if you have a lot of mulch, and if that's the case and you're watering correctly, I wouldn't be concerned because they're just breaking down the bark. Mushrooms are a sign of decomposition. They break down dead things. And so if you have mushrooms around the base, there's so many, this is a long answer, you know, but you might have dead roots. They might have died for a variety of reasons, but if mushrooms are present, we are decomposing something dead. And you need to figure out if it's the tree or if it's the bark. You might want to get an arborist involved.
The tree dies and it's already dead before the mushroom starts growing.
Correct, yeah, if the tree dies and there's mushrooms, the mushrooms are a reaction. They weren't the problem. Yeah. Okay. I should have most of this. Oh yeah, one really important thing. So, fruit management. When can I eat my fruit? Not this year. Not year one. If you have a brand new tree, don't leave fruit the first year. One, this tree has been uprooted from its soil where it came. If you're buying a tree that's bare root in a paper pot, they should not fruit the first year. They will. It's very draining. The nutrient, bone meal, phosphorus,